Welcome to this session of the DOD Cloud Exchange. I'm joined by Brian DeLong, the Chief Technology Officer for Enterprise Ground Services at the Space Force, Renata Spinks, the Assistant Director and Deputy Chief Information Officer of Command, Control, Communications, and Computers for the Marine Corps, and Sandra Lopez, the Enterprise and Cyber Solutions Operations Chief Technology Officer at Leidos. Everyone, thanks so much for taking the time to join me. We're going to continue our conversation about the cloud as we have over the last few days here on the DOD Cloud Exchange. And let's just start at the beginning. Brian, I'm going to ask you to start delivering data, compute services to the cloud. It's not a new thing for a lot of DOD, for really anybody at DOD. Let's just get the latest update on for your program where the Space Force is today.
Yeah, thanks. We've been doing quite a bit. We have a hybrid cloud strategy that we've been following. And as such, we have what we call a distributed service integration lab, or DSIL, that's working at multiple classification levels, multiple locations, that goes after our cloud efforts. And we really went after that to try and shift left our ability to provide operationally representative environments for doing tech transition across the board into the Space Force, especially with non-traditionals. And industry, we're seeing a lot of demand signals, as well as within our own sister government agencies, for the utilization of those integration labs. Integration of capabilities is really what we're going after to try and accelerate what I call the transition life cycle for capabilities across the board.
One of the things when you talk about the multiple classification levels, we've heard that there's this kind of growing demand for the secret, top secret levels. Are you seeing the same thing? Are a lot of the folks you're working with coming in and going, oh, the unclass is great, but what can we do at secret and top secret?
We're definitely seeing a lot of appetite across all the classification levels. And I think one of the big challenges that we see across the board is here at Enterprise Ground Services, we've actually taken the initiative to bring that down from the higher classification levels rather than work up from the unclass. And so we're bringing a lot of those really, really good secure practices and bringing those down to the unclassified level to actually go after that and then build the I would call it pipeline of pipelines approach, distributed repo strategies to really go after that and scale that out across the enterprise so that we can maximize our reuse and leverage capabilities across all those classification levels where appropriate.
There's a lot more to talk to. We'll come back around, I'm sure, to talk a little bit more about that, working top down instead of bottom up. I think that's a really interesting approach. Renata, let me come back to you about your cloud efforts. Last year, when you joined us for the DOD Cloud Exchange, the 2022 version, just to keep score, you talked about this idea of enclaves and reducing, I think it was something like 70 different enclaves, and now you're kind of you're getting down. Give us an update the last year. What have you done for me lately?
What have we done for me lately? Let me tell you. So those domains have been consolidated. We do reserve the consolidation of things like our recruiting command. So we didn't consolidate there. Our educational areas, your .edus of the world. We also have a space where we can come into and make sure that training can be done. And that's sometimes you're using enclaves outside of the Department of Defense. That's how we keep our Marines trained, both civilian and active duty. So we took a little bit of a deliberate approach and not so much consolidated everything into one, but we made a strategic approach to understand what capabilities do we still need to keep ourselves commercially available, as well as still maintaining that tight knitted space that we need. Not only did we execute from that perspective, but we took an approach of understanding that hybrid environment. So not everything can be consolidated and moved to the cloud. And so, of course, that's where you get into the warfighting piece of it, and because we fight on the SIPRnet. You just heard my colleague talk about, going from a bottom-up approach to a top-down approach and making data available despite the classification levels. And so how do you do that when you look at impact level 5s and 6s and your infrastructure that needs to be put in place because you want to run encryptions and different things like that? So lots of thought went into how we manage our data. So we do have a service data officer right now within the Marine Corps. You look across the other services, they have chief data offices. We're pretty small compared to big Army and big Navy. So we have a service data officer, and he works with the services very closely, but he kind of looks at how are we tagging our data and how are we taking advantage of that powerful compute processes and storage for data but even more so, where are the opportunities where we can manage our data a little bit better, a little bit more efficiently, so that we can operate in a space despite the classification level. So we've matured in probably the perspective of what we think about consolidation of cloud. And we've probably, I would say, evolved into taking a more hybrid approach. And with that approach, our strategy shifted a little bit more to managing our data versus the enclaves.
I think you make a really interesting point that everyone's going to be in this hybrid world, because there's certain things you just are never going to move to the commercial cloud, and that's fine. But other things that you do want to put in a more DoD-centric, a private cloud, or however,
yes, sir.
whatever we're going to call a data center these days.
Yes.
What is there a number you're going for? Hey, if we had 70 at one point, 20 is better, or 20 is really our ultimate. Do you have any thoughts around that?
You know, we didn't really take a numbers approach. I think what we did was we took a compliance approach. We were light years ahead when from a Marine Corps perspective on migrating to the cloud. COVID-19 helped a lot, not from the health perspective, but just teaching us how we can better utilize our workforce and enable them. So migrating to the cloud in less than 6 months from 2016 Microsoft to O365 was unheard of. And so we were, I like to say, better lucky than good in that space. But what it made us not really look at is not really the right number, but probably the feature and capability that's needed. I think that's what we started to zone in on, because you can get so caught up into quantitative analysis instead of qualitative. And oftentimes you could be providing the warfighter with yet another thing, but it's not exactly what they need.
I agree with you. So much times there's a lot of focus on this idea of, we need, if we can get down to X, but there is always that other side of the coin that says, well, 70 is too many, we know that, and 1 is too little. So what's the happy medium? Sandra, let me turn to you from a Leidos perspective. As you work with clients and you hear from Renata and Brian, what's kind of, how does what they said kind of fit into what you're seeing with your clients and others in the public sector?
So it's interesting. The question is very interesting. We're seeing that adoption of the cloud is really a cultural effort as much as it is a mission-driven imperative. So you're having to balance both needs as you are trying to move applications or data or whatever it is that you're trying to move to the cloud. From a cultural perspective, you see the Navy and Marine Corps taking a robust approach to moving things to the cloud, making sure that whatever they are engaging in from an on-prem revitalization and refurbishing to start actually looking at the right opportunities for moving things to the cloud, not just brushing everything, but actually picking, using a scalpel. What are the right things to move to the cloud to create the right outcomes? And we're seeing them furiously working on an approach that is so far very effective. And then you have the need for the tactical side, which is actually re-energizing while we look at the cloud. For the longest time, the cloud was, for the big things that are unclassified, that might be of generic enterprise use and value. Now we're starting to see mission-specific needs moving to being hosted in the cloud and being availed with the capabilities of the cloud. And that is a change, complete change for the warfighter. They're going to find speed. They're going to find fun in what they're doing. Their user experience interacting with that technology is going to re-energize them from the edge.
Sandra, I have to go back to something you said, because you said the word fun, and you hear a lot about cloud, you hear a lot about speed and user experience and potentially cost savings and accelerating capabilities to the tactical edge, right? You hear a lot about that, but you said the word fun. So I'm going to pick on that word, fun. What about moving to the cloud is fun? Well, why is there going to be more fun?
Well, remember,
I know the fun of this.
Remember, warfighters are quite span quite wide in the age group, right? But a lot of our very young warfighters are actually experiencing technology in a way that is like what they live every day. And that's what they want to do. They want to absolutely experience that technology the same way. So they're translating their fun and their excitement to the job they do every day.
I think that's actually a great point, because what we're seeing with the younger generation, and as an old person now, I'll say I don't really love talking about the younger generation, but there is something about that recruitment and retention and making it, we'll use the word fun for you. Let's broaden the discussion a little bit. I want to go back to something that Renata said about data. And I love the fact you talked about this idea of you have a service data officer and not necessarily a chief data officer. And because data is really the driver for cloud. And I'll open it up to the entire group, and please jump in as you see fit, but I'll start with Renata. What are you doing with your data, and how is it driving your cloud movement, your usage, your thoughts about cloud?
So having information when you need it at the time you need it to do what it is you need to do is 3 sets of capabilities that come off it just rolls off of us when we speak about it very easily, but it's one of the hardest things to do if you have not gotten your arms around data. And when I say getting your arms around data, you have to know where the data is, the classification of the data, but also the utilization of the data. Because if you don't know how you can use the data, then how can you classify it? And then if you can't classify it, then how can you protect it? So there's so many different things that we've looked at. The unclassified space, you heard about SharePoint migration. A lot of that information is used for our morning reports, for us to tell the logisticians where things need to be from a pre-positioning perspective. You have aviators who need that data to understand the maintenance of aircraft. So there's so much that's going on that you need information for, and information is dictated by the data that you use and the level that you use it at. I think important to the warfighter for us in the service data officer is understanding when you need the data and how much you need. You just heard my girlfriend from Leidos just now talk about making sure that the warfighter has that data and making it fun. Well, it's not fun if you're providing an application developer with so much data, and it's data that they don't need or they think that they can't use at that time. So now you're, instead of creating a problem solver, you have actually created a larger problem. And so that's what his name is Mr. Doctor, just got his doctorate. Congratulations to Dr. Colin Crosby. That's what he's working on. Those are the problems that he's solving. And he takes one of my favorite words, besides fun, because that is a favorite word of mine, but he takes outcomes, and we use objectives and key results to kind of pace ourselves on how we're going to focus on providing data and securing the data. And then lastly, you look at the combatant commands, and we have the Marine Corps Information Command, the MCIC is what we call it, and that's where you start to consolidate not only data, but you're starting to use intelligence, and you're starting to understand how is the adversary targeting the data that we have, and what are the things we need to do from a parameters perspective on how we not only, master parallel compute or store, but also how are we securing our data. So those are some of the problem sets that Dr. Crosby is going to solve for us.
Brian, why don't you jump in as well and talk a little bit about the data side of your efforts and where the cloud fits in, and how really that need for data and the understanding of the data, very similar to what Renata was talking about, really is driving some of your thoughts.
Yeah, so we are lucky enough that we have a sister organization, Cross Mission Data. So we actually have a whole organization that's dealing with the data and pulling that through the UDL and a couple of other things, which are heavily embracing the cloud and the multi-classification nature of all of that. So I think the one thing, though, that I've seen from my side in particular is we have a lot of requirements, and what kind of resonated there with how do we get the right data at the right time to the right place? But what we're also finding is that quickly changes. And so that need for that data and what that right data is and when the right time is. And so rather than requirements, how do we get smarter about the utilization of that data and making it available, and then training our entire force to get smart and how to cultivate that data, how to get that data to make the decisions and impact the decisions that they want to make there. So rather than just being requirements of I need XYZ field, et cetera, at this time, how do we get smarter about our data delivery across the board? And like I said, we have a whole data organization. So I'm definitely not the super SME with regards to that. But as we know, it impacts all of us. And we're used to having data at our fingertips. So that's something we're just going to see proliferate across all of our roles and responsibilities.
You know, Jason, I think artificial intelligence, machine learning investments is going to be very helpful there. You know, being able to have algorithms that can be trained to understand the repetition that occurs after that pattern is created, it kind of helps. Artificial intelligence, I think, in a machine learning will help us learn all of those repetitious things that we do every day. And then that allows us to have space for some of the more intelligence-driven decisions that have to have. You heard Brian talk about the ever-changing environment, and that occurs. But there are some things that we're going to have that steady. So I think that's where there's a lot of opportunity for our industry partners to help us as we have a commandant that's pushing us toward talent management and artificial intelligence and machine learning and taking advantage of automated technology. I think that's going to be very critical to how we manage our data and make sure that all the solutions that we're trying to provide to the warfighters, and not just warfighter in theater. You know, a lot of people think about deployments, they think about, you know, the commercials that you see and you're in the field, but even what I would call rear detached or stateside, there are challenges from a human resources perspective. There's challenges in recruitment. There's challenges in how we pay our Marines. There's so many opportunities to use automation to free up those skill sets to work on some of those more unique problems that we often can't anticipate.
My colleagues here have identified a key area, data. So our services for the longest time have actually liked to move data closer to where it's supposed to be used, not where it's generated. And so when she talks about artificial intelligence and machine learning, if we can start applying that technology closer to where the data is generated, then we don't have to move all the data upstream. We just have to take the outcomes of that analysis and feed it for insight and higher insight, and making sure that we inventory the data properly, that we attach it to the right domain for ownership and authenticity. It's just absolutely as critical as it is to consume it from an outcomes perspective.
You make a really interesting point of driving that data closer towards being, or driving the tools where the data is being generated. The data gets driven probably everywhere. Mm-hmm. Is that something that, as you talk to clients, as you're seeing, whether it's through solicitations or other discussions you have, that's really what Renata and Brian and others are asking for from Leidos and your partners?
Yes, absolutely. So we are seeing a high demand in requirements for making sure that we no longer create data lakes, that we actually don't create swamps, that we actually create informed data repositories, and that we distribute the ownership of the rules and the management of those data products closer to where they are generated. And along with that comes the mining of the data and not having to replicate the data and not having to move it all the way up to the top. Remember, the data is generated for different purposes, but artificial intelligence and machine learning allow us to actually use it for multiple reasons.
Brian, let me come back around to you because I think one of the pieces here is data is one piece of this puzzle, but there's other pieces that you all are putting together from the Space Force's perspective. Just doing a little bit of research, I know that one of the big challenges with enterprise ground services was kind of ad hoc nature of it. And one of the goals, I think, of your program is to kind of add some governance and some, for lack of a better word, standardization. And that's where the cloud also can help you out. Maybe talk a little bit about where you're going with your program and how the cloud's driving some of those directions.
Yeah, I think for us, especially on the tactical C2 side of the house, is the challenge with going all in on the cloud right now is that we do have hardware requirements for hardware-based crypto, other types of things like that. So that's definitely why the hybrid cloud, for at least for us in the near term, is the way to go while we sort through some of the design patterns and architectures so that we can really leverage the cloud-based capabilities. I think the other thing that I heard my colleagues on the panel talk about is how do we make the right choices based off of a wide variety of inputs into that. So what's our decision-making framework as we talk through that? And one of the things that I hear a lot, even as we throw the word data around, there's real-time data, there's near real-time data, there's long-tail data that we're working through. And then you move up the stack for platform as a service or infrastructure as a service, and we have all those things. Part of it's just being able to articulate and talk about those in such a way that we can communicate effectively and efficiently around what we need to put in place surrounding those things. So a lot of the analogies come down, and we spend a lot of time talking about non-tech things. I like to throw out the silverware analogy. We talk about silverware all the time, and we assume, but we don't really know if we're talking about a fork, a spoon, a knife, and we inadvertently in the tech world, as we talk about data and one size fits all, or a data approach, or that it's the same way of the poor person that we don't want to get stuck trying to eat soup with a fork, right? And so I think a lot of this, as we work through that, is being smart and educating all of us as to what the needs are and what we mean with certain terms, and working through that. So how do we put the right tool in the right place for the right person to actually do the job that they're tasked with?
I love that analogy of let's not eat soup with a fork. We know what happens when you do that, except for if it's chunky soup. I mean, I remember old commercials, but
It's gumbo.
if it's wow, that's a good point. You missed the
Point
soup
there.
part.
You got to put.
Don't make us hungry. Just wanted to highlight one thing that Brian did say, is that taxonomy piece. And Renata, is that something that you are starting to maybe talk to with the service data officer? Is when we call the tool, or we talk about the same thing? I always love that. Back in the good old days of enterprise architecture discussion and reference models, and the thing that made us all bored to death, but was really valuable.
But it was fun.
It was fun.
Yeah.
There's that word.
I tell you, the taxonomy is something that the Deputy Commandant of Information, Lieutenant General Glavy, we just spoke about that last staff meeting, about making sure we can get the data right, and not perfect, but just getting data right and identifying what are the commonalities and how we're going to classify or tag and categorize the data, so that we have the things available to then insert, if you want to use Brian's analogy, you got to have a drawer to put the silverware in. Okay. And then you need the drawer that has the section for the fork, the spoon, the knife, and because I had a salad earlier. So the salad spoon, the salad fork, right? So that's so important. And honestly, I think that's the most critical piece. If you don't have a taxonomy that works for your users or your warfighter, then everything else is probably for naught, because that is your limitation. It's a limitation. And so that's something that the Marine Corps is definitely focusing on. We are grabbing resources from industry. Lots of research and development is out there on some taxonomies. In my prior life at the U.S. Treasury, I had a lot of time spent with the Enterprise Architecture Group and understanding how, the Office of Financial Research is all about data. So spending 4 to 5 years with industry within the Office of Financial Research and U.S. Treasury, figuring out those taxonomies has been a valuable space for me as I start to understand these are our blind spots, and we don't have to try to recreate the wheel. There's so many models out there. The National Security Agency has some models that we could take a look at. So that's where we lean on people to my left here to, kind of help us decipher what's the best taxonomy that we can use, and what's the approach, recognizing it will not be, like Brian said, it is not a one size fits all. You look at the Pacific, their solutioning sets, the categorization will probably be the same from a social security number or a name and ID. But when you start to think about the regions, and you start to think about the fires and how the targeting is, it's very different in Japan than it is at Camp Lejeune. Mm-hmm. And so we have to make sure we're still considering that.
And so if I can add, so there's the aspect of governance. There's certain governance rules that are going to come from the enterprise. There's certain governance rules that are going to come closer to where the fight takes place. That has to be amalgamated in order to produce enough rules that people can actually generate their data products in a way that conforms to the taxonomy. The data is normalized so that it can be consumed, so that it can be used for the purposes of insight and intelligence. Mm-hmm. Very recently, someone brought to my attention that everything is not about intelligence. It's about insights. And so I think to a large extent, they're going to have to walk a very tight rope in harmonizing the enterprise needs with the warfighter needs, and find a common set of rules that applies from a data governance perspective.
I tell you, that's something that you hear about McSend 2030 and us moving this into Marine Corps Enterprise Network and utilizing it in exercises is now where we take those enterprise capabilities and say, okay, what part of the enterprise can we utilize where we would say at the edge or in a contested environment? And that's something that the Marine Corps is working diligently on. We have about 3 or 4 exercises where that's being tested. And the reason that's being tested is because it lends to, what Sandra was saying, how do you harmonize that? What's the unique balance? And I like to say, from my deployment days, you have to be ready to pivot consistently. What you thought was true 90 days ago is probably not true today. So how do you pivot and harmonize with the data and allow that symphony to occur without losing capability?
One of the things as we've been talking throughout our conversation and the data and where we are today with cloud is all this is leading down a path of what's the future look like. So Brian, let me throw it to you to start this part of the discussion is where are you heading? What are some of the short and long and medium term goals that the Space Force and Enterprise Ground Services you're aiming to complete, whether in 2023 or beyond?
Yeah, pretty excited about what the future holds there as we continue on our hybrid cloud journey, really adding what I've called multi-cloud, going back to our silverware and being able to talk about the things we have in our drawer. So from a multi-cloud perspective, how do we get more than one government community cloud under our belt so that we can make the right choices to put the right workloads in the right locations with the right connectivity to go after that. And so shortly after that, if we do that right, we're working on workload mobility, which allows us to move and migrate our workloads. I'm going to say easily. That's a trap always, but easily between those environments. So back to our discussions around data, back to our discussions around environment and things changing, we're going to make the right decision with the right information that we have at the time, but we all know how quickly that's changing and accelerating. So even though we make the right hosting choice at that time, very quickly that hosting choice may pivot or may change, whether it's risk posture, whether it's pricing, whether it's classification upgrade, declassification, those types of things across the board so that we can pivot that and move that workload to the right location so that we can get the most out of it. So probably over the next 12, 18 months, a lot of our focus is on that multi-cloud and workload mobility aspects.
One of the things you said that I just want to maybe hit upon is the idea of the multi-cloud. And because clouds, each kind of instance is different, right? If you use X, that's different than Y, and for good reason. Is that one of the reasons why you're trying to say we need this multi-cloud approach? Not just because it's good business, because it makes sense, because you don't put all your eggs in one basket, but because the capabilities can be so different among different providers.
The capabilities can be different. Multi-classification just compounds that, and that's not something that you really have to deal with coming from my commercial industry background. So trying to figure that out as well. And then just watching the maturation rate of the capabilities offered by the different cloud providers at the different classifications. So we try to make the best decisions we can, but that whole landscape is evolving very quickly. So how do we make the right choices, but then give us that mobility? I think the other piece that we're thinking through and changes when you start to see IT as part of the weapon system or the weapon system is what do we do if that capability is trying to be denied? And it's not that things won't come back, but our assurance that we have access to the capability when we need it is key. And so we may be trading a little bit of what I would say upfront velocity for long-term velocity or velocity when it matters to make sure that we have access to that capability is key. And so a lot of those choices may seem to be a little slow up front, but they give us a lot more speed when it really matters. One of the other analogies I like to go to is paired programming. If you just look at that up front, you're like, man, that seems really slow. We're doubling up every person looking at the code, working on the code. That's true until you want to grow at scale and fission your team. And if you're going to fission your team, you take your paired programmers, you split them, you add 2 people to that. Now you have 4 people that are up to speed working on a problem. You fission them, you're at 8. If you never fission somebody, it's probably not taking the true benefit of that design pattern and that capability. But if you do fission, it's one of the only ways that you can truly scale a team and get shared consciousness and move after something. So knowing the why something is done and then leveraging it at the appropriate time is really key as we want to move forward and capitalize on what we have available to us.
I think Brian makes a great point of some of the things the Marine Corps is doing. And what I heard him talk about was talent management. You know, upskilling and reskilling, cross-skilling an organization is so critical nowadays. There's no reason why everyone is not a cyber warrior. There's so much that everyone can contribute to the fight. So it's great to hear him talk about managing talent and maximizing all of the capabilities that we can bring to bear. Some of the things that the Marine Corps is also looking at these next 18 months, besides the talent management and talent management, not just on our civilian workforce, but also within the Marine Corps, as we have a recruitment effort for active duty Marines. And, people have heard about the 17XX cyber MOSs and the contracts that are available there, but not just in the cyber space, but also just across the board, embedding technology and just foundational cybersecurity, making it part of Sandra's word, culture, making it part of the culture. And so that is an area that we're spending a lot of time on. The Commandant just released Talent Management 2030, a secondary document. I think it actually came out this morning, if my memory serves me correctly. But we're also taking a look at how we manage our forces from a zero trust perspective. A lot of those capabilities that you turn the TV on, or you Google IT capabilities or mandates. If you Google mandates, the first thing you see is zero trust, right? And so sometimes we can get a little diluted with the word zero trust, but I try not to be complacent with the word zero trust. I try to make sure that we understand there's still a way we have to manage identities. There's still a necessity of metrics and measuring success and being able to allow data to help us make decisions. So investing in identity, credential, and access management is key. It is the holy grail because, and if you don't believe me, ask the adversary. Most times that you don't see an adversary trying to infiltrate metrics, right? You don't see that. Right.
Why not?
It's not fun. That's why it's not fun. But they definitely want to come after credentials. They definitely want to, take on your identity and move laterally and bilaterally across your network. So identity and credential access management at the enterprise is something the Marine Corps is looking at and taking action on. Forcing mechanism was moving to the cloud. You can no longer try to manage multiple identities or without federating because of the necessity of the mission threads. Everyone's not taking advantage of O365 100% of the time. Sometimes you can take a look at things that they need to have access, and you have to control that. Everyone cannot be just grouped into the entire pool of expertise and access. And then lastly, but most importantly, is taking advantage of all the authorities and coupling the different authorities that we have. And that's when I start talking about operationally. How do you operationalize the data that you're accessing? And then make sure that you can respond and have your network as resilient as possible. So you hear the Marine Corps talk, and the Department of Navy actually talk about cyber readiness. And so that's how we would like our applications and our information environment to be so resilient that instead of a checkbox on our authorities to operate and risk management implementation, instead of doing so on a checklist, which I am all about governance and I am all about compliance, but I'm also all about operationalizing the need to be compliant. So while we're checking the boxes and saying, yes, I'm compliant, I need you to be able to sustain that compliance. And I'm going to base that on your readiness instead of just compliant when you're applying for the authority to operate. you get your authority to operate, and the discipline stops there. And so what readiness does is it invokes a little bit of discipline. So those are three areas that we in the Marine Corps and Department of Navy are focusing on.
You bring up the cyber readiness issue. It's something that I know we've talked to you about in the past, and something that the Department of Navy is really focused on. Is that kind of driving some of the cloud usage as well, in the sense of you had this plan, you have this strategy in place, and we know you need better roles, responsibilities around ICAM. Is that all kind of being driven by, obviously they need to be more secure, but because you're moving too much, you're becoming this almost decentralized approach to compute and storage and the like?
I would like to say that is the reason, but I think cyber first. I think that we just have such a vicious and sophisticated adversary that whether you're using on-premises capabilities or the commercial cloud or gov cloud, you can't get around increasing your resiliency from a readiness perspective. That means continuous monitoring has to be put in place. We've been talking about continuous monitoring since 2012.
Comply to connect.
Right, and comply to connect. We've been talking about it, and Congress has been beating us down and providing us with capabilities, and it's just been so difficult to produce or to, I would say, deploy those types of capabilities. Because again, just like when we say zero trust, or when we say, have the data at the time you need it, when you need it for the decisions, it's very easy to say, but it is critical, and it's complicated and complex to implement, especially when you have federal acquisition regulations to think about. You have contracts that are already in place that were based on 2010 capabilities. So all of the backtracking that has to happen also has to be considered. And so while those are not excuses, they definitely are enablers and dependencies of us being able to produce the outcomes that we're trying to produce. So I think it's a combination of both the need to move to the cloud for the capabilities that are there, coupled with you still have an adversary that's already in your network. If you don't think that, then we're all delusional, and we should probably stop today and do something different. But they're already in your network. For newer capabilities, how can we develop applications and capability and deploy with security in mind? And you do that through that task force, task organized approach. So you hear us talk a lot about task force modernization and task groups. And that's how we get after it. And those cybersecurity personnel, our defensive cyber operations teams, they are in the room with our capabilities development teams. And they are almost giving aha moments. They're saying things like, hey, well, I know you want to enable that function, but let's think about this together. And then we start to see synchronizations of how we can better deploy. So I think the forcing mechanism is both the need to move to the cloud and also a vicious adversary that's resident.
So I'm so glad you set me up for this one. So on one side, you see the need to be more efficient. On the other side, you need to be a little less trusting.
Yes.
And so you have zero trust as your next journey. As you move to the cloud, you're re-homing your applications. You are rethinking how you protect the data. It's not protecting just the application, it's the data. That's your most important asset. And so Leidos is investing quite substantially in that next generation integrated data platform, where we support cyber and we support cybersecurity with zero trust and AI ops. Talk about those areas where we are automating. So our thinking is that if we can start that journey and mature that journey towards zero trust, you are inherently creating the proper environment for that data to be protected properly.
Yeah, I hear the inherit, and I think that's what gives you that continuous monitoring capability. When you start to inherit security systems and security mechanisms versus having to create it on the back end, and in my developer days, you're trying to deploy and security tells you can't. That's one of the most frustrating experiences you can have as a developer. And so when you can enable the developer to inherit all of the things that are necessary as best as possible based on some type of risk acceptance, I think you're at least 90% of the way there.
Brian, that's also obviously where the automation comes in. We talk a lot about DevSecOps and those platforms. Is that something that security automation, that inheritance, is that something you all also have been spending some time focused on?
Yeah, for sure. Automation, especially as we talk multi-classification, geolocation, and multi-cloud, having that automation for the deployment of the capabilities, updating, maintaining, securing those capabilities all come into play. One of the other things for us that's also key, as we talk through Zero Trust, we talk through a lot of the ancillary initiatives that are floating around out there. Machine-to-machine interfaces and those types of things also become key, because a lot of what we're really good at is securing the people, securing the identities, but then working through those machine-to-machine interfaces as well for things is also important. And that's a topic that probably doesn't get enough discussion as we talk through all those things. But from us on the ground side, it is very paramount to executing on our mission there by doing that. But automation's king. I think part of what falls through with that too is the talk around declarative state, which also doesn't get enough talking about. And so the amount of people that have one-off, well, we're 90% automated, but there's like 3 things that Joe or Sally or Fred do that's key that they remember to do, and it's not that big of a deal. And I'm like, that actually is a really, really big deal as we move forward to go after. And so one of the things we talked about early on, and philosophically, do we try to get it right and then automate, or do we automate and then try to get it right? And if you do both and you're professional and you do both, it sort of doesn't matter. But then you enter the human component of that. And what we found was once the team got it right, they didn't want to work on it anymore. They wanted to go work on other things. And so they never really got around to automating it because it worked. It was right. It was done. Right. And we wanted to move on. And so from the human factor and the leader factor, I kind of had to change my opinion on that. And so we go after automation first, and then we work to get it right as we go. And it shouldn't matter, but it does. And that's kind of one of the aha moments we had as I came to work on this program and work through that.
I want to just shift a little bit, because we've been talking a lot about, we got to move to the cloud, take care of integrations, automation, cybersecurity, zero trust, all these kind of things that happen. But all that is dependent on the budget, of course. And, some will say, well, Renata and Brian, you have enough money. You're in the DOD. There's always plenty of money. We know that's never the case, but it's nice to hear, I guess. So let's talk about how you're dealing with that budget question and how you're finding that right balance, because it's a perennial challenge, not just for DOD, but for every agency.
Yeah, I tell you.
It's a deep breath one too, I know, yeah.
It is. We've been experiencing budget fluctuation for years, multiple administrations, so we can't really ignore it or act like it doesn't exist. But I think the past 5 years that I've been within the Marine Corps, I think moving to the technology business model, I think has been very beneficial, because it kind of forced us to start thinking of pillars and how you actually cost out IT, right? It also started to feed how we execute contracts, right? So you have your IDIQs and you have your 1 year and 2 year OTAs and different things like that. So there's a lot of options in the acquisition space that I think we can take advantage of with the budget that we have. So that's one thing. Using acquisition in a more lean manner and leaning out the organization as best as possible. Again, you heard me talk about our task force network modernization model. We also have our acquisition professionals in the room, basically telling us what's in the realm of possible, what market research is out there, what capabilities that we can take advantage of, and most importantly, what's on the contracts. What are the line items that we may or may not be paying attention to because our heads are down and we're just pushing. And we may be passing up capabilities that already exist that we feel like, oh, we need another contract for that, right? And so that's strategically. Financially, I think what I've seen within the Marine Corps is engaging more with not just industry, but engaging more with, those different RFIs or requests for information that comes from Congress and staffers, and being able to intelligently communicate the challenges that we're facing. Being informed on the NDAA and the National Defense Strategies and appropriations. I think all of that is critical to be more efficient spenders of the budget that we have. So my grandmother would tell me, stop complaining about what you don't have and do something efficient with what you do have. So I take that to heart when I come into the workspace and think about our fiscal responsibility. And so if we had a Brinks truck, it would be wonderful. Let me be clear when I say that. It would be excellent if we could just, go shopping through the IT mall and have all these great capabilities, but that's just not the reality. And so I think being able to articulate the results and outcomes that we're looking for, being able to govern ourselves accordingly and being informed on what the National Defense Strategies and even what our counterparts outside the Department of Defense are investing in. It all comes down to, can we be more efficient so that we can maximize and get a larger return of investment? And then I think lastly is how we execute within the space. If you look at industry standards, they're becoming more and more agile, and they're leaning into how you produce and deploy capabilities to your network. And so incremental success is what we like to look at in the Marine Corps, especially when it comes to the information environment. Trying to just eat the entire elephant is what they say. You can't eat the elephant, right? But you can take chunks and chunks and chunks and get better and better. And by the time you start to deploy certain, I would say features or capabilities, it also gives you an opportunity to pivot. So again, my favorite word is efficient. We have to be as efficient as we can with the dollars that we have, because there's the Brinks truck it does exist. It's just not pulling up to the Pentagon for Marine Corps. So
probably not pulling up to the Space Force either. Brian, we have just a few minutes left. Let me just offer that same, how are you kind of balancing that need versus budget?
Yeah, it's as we've heard and as we've all dealt with that's just something we all continually juggle from there. A lot of what we just heard really resonates. Efficiency is key. I think the other piece that we have is, how are we aware and also creating awareness amongst each other of the capabilities that we have and how those can be leveraged. So how do we cross-pollinate innovation or contracts or those types of things across the board? I think the other piece that we're leveraging to try to go after that, and it's a bigger education challenge than I would have thought initially, is going after consumption-based models. Whether that be hardware as a service, whether that be professional services, and being super smart there on getting all of those things together, because a lot of times it's the ancillary capabilities that come along with just purchasing the license or just purchasing the initial capability, where you actually get that efficiency. And then how do we act as an enterprise? Like, a lot of what we're seeing is siloed. And so how do we get economies of scale with our purchasing and with our bulk purchasing power across the board? So can we set up an enterprise cloud hosting office and those types of things to go after that without going back to the things we discussed earlier on the show of an extra large t-shirt for everybody, right? Because nobody wants to buy in and nobody's going to partner if they're going to get a shirt that they're never going to wear and they're embarrassed about, right? So, but that efficiency is really what we have to go after, in my opinion, and agree with my panel colleagues on that one. Is probably the biggest thing that we can go after together to achieve that.
And
Brian,
Sandra,
just stole my thunder. So my comment on that is, I don't think that we have expanded or opened up our aperture for as a service, as a consumption model. I think there's IT is IT, no matter whether it is one service branch or a different one. IT is IT, and I think that IT is at the point of maturity, and we just need a little trust from the service branches to trust built the outcomes properly in the contracts, and if you build the outputs, if you build the outcomes properly in the contracts, we will have a very resilient enterprise at the right price for you.
I'm zero trust over here.
This stuff works on the commercial side.
Yeah.
There is no reason why it cannot work for defense. There is absolutely no reason for that.
Yeah.
Because the defense is a bunch of snowflakes and they're all different. You know that. Unless if you got one quick comment, otherwise we're pushing up against the clock.
No, I think what you're talking about is just culture. We definitely all have to commit to doing better in that space.
All right. Well, through conversations like these, obviously, this is one step in that direction. But unfortunately, we don't have time for this session of the DoD Cloud Exchange. So let me thank my guests. Sandra Lopez is the Enterprise and Cyber Solutions Operations Chief Technology Officer at Leidos. Brian DeLong is the Chief Technology Officer for Enterprise Ground Services at the Space Force. And Renata Spinks is the Assistant Director and Deputy Chief Information Officer of Command, Control, Communications, and Computers for the Marine Corps. Everyone, thank you so much for taking the time today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm Jason Miller, and you've been listening to Federal News Network. Now let me send you back to the studio.